Hello everybody and welcome back to another Sponge Chat. My name is Jim and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all. So firstly, before we get into looking at who I've gone and got for this Sponge Chat, I'd like to say I hope that you all have a lovely Christmas, depending when you're watching this, and finishing off the 2022 year in a very good way. This year has been, for me personally, it's been quite an exciting year. Lots of things have been happening. But I'm also very excited for 2023. I'm going to be presenting at IA TEFL, TESOL Spain, and within the academy, with the management team that I work with, we're thinking about the 22-23 academic year, and how we're going to be incorporating tasks into the curriculum, and it's all very exciting for me. So I'm looking forward to 2023 and I hope that you all are as well. But let's get back to why we're here. So as you all know, I'm a very big fan and advocate of task-based language teaching. I think it is something that should be mainstream but is not mainstream, and there are perhaps a number of reasons for that. Now, I was lucky enough to speak with Martin East, who is an expert within LTB. He's written books on the matter. He's presented at so many conferences, and I was very lucky for him to dedicate some time to sit down with me. In fact, I reviewed one of his books, one of his latest Cambridge Element, which looked at innovation through a TBLT lens and looking at working with pre-service teachers, and it was fascinating. So in this Sponge Chat, we went deeper into TBLT and tasks, and it was really insightful for perhaps two reasons, at least for me. The first one was the fact that I love TBLT, and I got to pick Martin's brain about certain areas and look at his opinions of certain things, perhaps looking at some of the ideals of task-based language teaching and then looking at the realities and how they need to merge. But also the second thing, I think, was that we looked at the difficulties that teachers may face when starting to use TBLT, and how they might overcome those things. So I found it really insightful. I do hope that you find it insightful as well. I'd love to hear back from you, so please get in touch via comments in YouTube or on LinkedIn, through the blog. I do respond, I do get back to everyone, even if it takes me a little bit of time. So without further ado, let's get into it. I hope you have a lovely time at the end of the year, and we'll see you soon for another Sponge Chat. Bye. Hi, Martin. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi there, Jim. Thanks for the invite, and I'm looking forward to this chat with you, albeit virtually.
Brilliant. As I was saying, working within TBLT or being involved in TBLT, your name comes up a lot, and you know, to have you here speaking about your work is a real pleasure. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you for the.
Yeah, it's your name and your work, it's been really, really influential, I think, and especially your foundations book, which for me, we'll get into that later, I suppose, but the fact that it was actually released as an online version for free was really nice, I think, and quite useful for a lot of teachers. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, as I usually do. A bit of a brief spiel about Sponge Chats for those that are perhaps here for the first time. Sponge Chat started a number of years ago, and basically it was to look at the professional journeys of teacher educators and see how people moved into those positions. It's sort of evolved now into looking at the journeys of materials writers, editors, all sorts of things. And this new sub-series is called Perspectives. And basically it's looking at going deeper into specific areas. And I'm really happy to have you here to go deeper into TBLT, something that we're both really, really passionate about. My first question is always a big question. Who is Martin?
Okay, who am I? Well, At present, I'm a language teacher educator. I'm a professor of language education at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And I also am the head of a really large department, which is cultures, languages, and linguistics. So I've got quite a broad spectrum of stuff that I'm involved in at this particular point in time.
That's a lot. And okay, so you mentioned language teacher education. Um, how does one, obviously, your journey into language teacher, you didn't start there. What was the journey? Where did you start and how did you move into, or what was the reason? What was your reason for moving into language teacher education?
Okay, so perhaps I should go back many, many years, way back to the 1970s when I was at school. And
Mm,
that's where I first started learning languages. So I started with French and then picked up German as well. And I
wow.
really enjoyed learning languages. I was really passionate about it. And then went on to study languages at university. And that was a period of shift, I think, in the way in which teachers were teaching languages at the time. We were just moving out of a very traditional grammar translation, teacher-led model into a more interactive, communicative model. And I suppose my experience of learning a language was at the cusp of that particular practice. And whether that helped in developing my passion for languages, I don't know. But then eventually I became a school teacher of languages and ended up heading up a department of French and German in a school in South London. And as part of that work, we partnered with a teacher education college. And they used to send teachers to be placed with us to work. So their model of teacher education was very much practice focused and working in the classroom focused. And so we as teachers were the ones who actually became the teacher educators.
Right.
And so that was my first journey into teacher education, was actually working as a teacher alongside people who were working in schools pretty much full time to do their teacher education. It wasn't, however, until I emigrated to New Zealand that I actually took up language teacher education as a dedicated part of my professional life. So I left school teaching at that time. I joined the University of Auckland and became a teacher educator.
Mm. And if I remember correctly, you've been involved in different areas of language teacher education. So predominantly in pre-service context, is that correct?
Yeah, predominantly pre-service. So when I started working in a teacher education program at the University of Auckland, that was very much pre-service dedicated. I have also done some in-service work. So I've been involved in Ministry of Education funded work with practicing school teachers. And now I currently teach in my new department on a master's in TESOL degree, which is
Right,
designed
of course.
primarily for those teachers who have had experience of teaching. So that's more an in-service professional development, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. Just a bit off topic of what we're going to talk about, but in terms of the differences between pre-service and in-service,
Mhm.
would you say there are stark differences between the two?
I don't think there are stark differences between the two. I think pre-service teachers come into a pre-service program often with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of desire to embrace new ideas, and that can be good. But then when they get further on the track, they then come into clashes with more experienced teachers who may see things somewhat differently, and that can become a barrier for them. In-service teachers also often embark on professional development with enthusiasm because
Mm,
they've been teaching for a while and they think, hey, I'd like to try something new. Let's get into some professional development here. But then they can sometimes face similar barriers when they're working with classes they've been working with for quite a while and still face things that are coming up that work against the innovations they might be trying to look at. So they're similar contexts. I mean, there are differences, but I think teachers on the whole are teachers. They want to do the best for their students, but there are other tensions that they're facing in their day-to-day lives.
yeah. I think that was for those that, I mean, I've shared this quite a lot and I wrote a review about it, but your element actually goes into a lot of detail about that.
Yeah.
And looking at especially it was quite interesting looking at maybe some of the differences of looking at the experiences that teachers bring to the training course. You know, I think the majority of what you're talking about in your element was looking at pre-service and
Yeah.
looking at their perhaps their learning experiences or their perceptions of what teaching is, whereas teachers may already have in-service teachers may have quite a lot of experience to bring to that.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what it was really, really interesting to read about, trying to deal with those and the importance of recognizing those experiences. I think there was one part in your conclusion where you were basically saying that we need to work from those experiences. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's actually where we need to begin with teacher education. We need to have a look at where the teachers we're working with have come from.
Right.
What have been their experiences? What has shaped the way they view language teaching and learning at a particular point in time? What beliefs have they developed over time around effective teaching? And that's where we need to begin. So beginning with the people themselves and understanding this is where the teachers I'm working with are currently at. And that then helps to frame how we might take them forward.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I mean that's a whole nother Spanish chat in itself, going into detail about that. But if we shift back onto perhaps what you're most well known for, and that's your contributions to TBLT, what sparked your interest in task-based language teaching? Because as you mentioned in your element, TBLT is not mainstream, and
No.
even though it's been around for quite some time, even Long was talking about it in the 80s, and it's been around for a while, but it's still not mainstream. What sparked your interest in task-based language teaching?
I think that goes back again to my early experiences of actually learning a language. As I said earlier, I was learning a language on that transition between moving out of grammar translation and moving into communicative language teaching. And then when I actually became a language teacher in the 1980s, communicative language teaching was very much at the forefront of people's thinking. Not necessarily always in their practice, but certainly they were beginning to think around communicative ways of teaching languages. But when I first started teaching French and German, I wanted to be communicative and I wanted to find ways of getting my students to see language as an authentic tool for authentic communication in real contexts. But I sometimes struggled with that. I struggled with the theory of wanting to do that and the reality of still finding this tendency to focus on grammar and focus on practice exercises, etc., etc. And I struggled with that for quite a number of years. And it wasn't, in fact, until I moved to New Zealand that I was confronted more directly with the theory around task-based language teaching when I went into teacher education. And it's when I looked at the theory that I thought, hey, that's what I've been trying to do in my practice for all of these years. I've been trying to move into this authentic interactive model and have never known quite how to do it. Task-based language teaching is clearly one of the key means in which we can do that. So that's what sparked my interest in task-based language teaching as a pedagogical approach.
Right. And from there then, was your learning, I suppose, or your integration into task-based language teaching, was that quite self-directed, or was there a support network there? Were there people that were also interested in task-based language teaching?
Yeah, there were quite a number of us at the time in New Zealand researching task-based language teaching. Around that time, Rod Ellis was working at the University of Auckland. We worked in two completely separate departments in two different campuses, so our paths rarely crossed, but obviously the work he was doing was quite influential in the New Zealand context in terms of what was going on in the school sector. So I was being exposed to his work, I was being exposed to ideas that he and his colleagues were sharing, and also with our Ministry of Education, who were supporting and encouraging a task-based approach. So yeah, there was quite a lot of stuff going on around that was supporting that particular direction.
It sounds like you were very lucky in that sense also. Rod Ellis, another huge name, of course. So for those if you had to, also there may be some people that are still quite new to task-based language teaching. I think it's also become one of those catchphrases now where people are throwing it around, perhaps without really understanding what it is. If you had to give a very brief explanation of what task-based language teaching is, what would you say?
Okay, I think I would say task-based language teaching is a learner-centered and experiential approach to teaching a language. So it focuses on the students and what the students themselves do, rather than the teachers and what the teachers teach. And its primary focus is on a task, which is something that students do either independently or more often collaboratively with others in the classroom, where they're experimenting with language, they're trying things out, they're trying to use language in authentic context. So that's what I would say is the essence of task-based language teaching.
Yeah. I think this idea of also the element of task itself is quite an important element in that. And again, perhaps that's the part that's perhaps misunderstood quite a lot of the time.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, with its primary focus on task completion, meaning focus, and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Now, if within task-based language teaching, it's quite SLA heavy. If we look at the theory, and there's a good reason for that. But perhaps that's one reason why teachers are turned off from it. If there were 2 or 3 components of task-based language teaching or working with tasks that you felt teachers should focus on, if they had to choose a small number of things to focus on, what would they be?
I would say try to design a task that has meaning and relevance for students to do. So, for example, I mean, depending on the proficiency of the students that you've got, getting them talking around, planning what they might like to do during their summer holidays, and sharing in perhaps pairs or a small group around different plans that people might have for the future, or setting up a debate about a contemporary issue that students are, that's in students' thinking, and getting them to share perspectives on what they might think about that. So getting them using language for a real purpose and interacting with each other around a real purpose. I think that would be maybe the main pedagogical things that I want to encourage as people start experimenting with task-based language teaching.
Yeah. Okay. That's brilliant. Thank you. You've also, I mean, you've spent quite a lot of your time as a language teacher educator working with teachers, sort of bringing them into this world of task-based language teaching, trying to prepare them for the realities of using tasks in the real world. And your element goes into a lot of detail about that within its 60 pages. You know, it's quite a quick read, but there's a lot packed into it. What are some of your main takeaways then for perhaps the language teacher educators listening to this that also would like to raise awareness of task-based language teaching?
Okay. I'd say on the one hand, teacher education is a positive influence in terms of moving teachers' practices forward. So it has an important place and it has value. It's through teacher education that we can raise teachers' awareness around new ideas and encourage them to start practicing new ideas. On the other hand, we need to see that teachers are still going to hold on to some traditional ideas and traditional practices in the background, and there's actually nothing wrong with that. So we need to see that those two things are working in tandem. We can move teachers forward and getting them experimenting, but we should not be overly concerned if teachers do still from time to time fall back on more traditional practices.
You surprisingly in your element, you mentioned you're perhaps more in favor of a task supported syllabus or approach. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that because of the realities of most contexts, most teaching contexts?
Yeah, I think that my thinking has shifted in that. When I first began in language teacher education, and coming back to the point I made earlier around a lot of support in New Zealand for task-based language teaching, I began with this very idealistic view that I could take these brand new teachers who were enthusiastic about becoming teachers and get them to be the catalysts for innovation in schools through task-based language teaching. I very quickly learned that that wasn't the reality. I very quickly learned that as soon as they went into schools, they faced challenges with other colleagues, challenges with classrooms, challenges with students sometimes not liking tasks, etc., etc. And therefore, their practices became moderated as they went through. And as I began to reflect on that, which is the main purpose of the element that I wrote, I began to see, well, perhaps this purely task-based or strongly task-based approach isn't necessarily the best one or the ideal one, at least for the context that I was working in. And therefore, I've tended to move more towards a hybrid model or more of a task-supported model. But I do make the point in the element that I still want to remain open to future evidence. So I continually look at the evidence that's out there. I continually reflect on practice. And I'm happy for my stance to shift. If further evidence comes to light that we can move teachers more strongly onto a strong task-based approach, then I'm open to looking at that.
Yeah. I think when for example, myself, when I started reading about task-based language teaching, my first encounters were, books written by Long or articles written by Long. Yep. And I think Long is quite, or was, I should say, sorry, was quite radical in his ideas compared to many of us. And his perspective on TBLT is brilliantly written. But in terms of implementing it, I really want to be able to implement that. But the realities of my context, and more so, I think, and perhaps we'll talk about this later, is the idea of how assessment it's perhaps not aligned with TBLT in many of the places where I work, especially as a language teacher educator. I work with teachers in the primary and the secondary sector, and I often talk to them. Trying out tasks is great, but the question always comes about, well, that's not what learners are assessed on, and so that's the big thing. So reading the Long and stuff like that, the realities of the classroom perhaps dictate more a task-supported syllabus.
Yeah.
And I think personally, I think that perspective of, if we can at least provide the support to implement a task-supported syllabus, we're perhaps going to have more success in the long run. I hope.
Yeah.
But so this difference then, for those that are listening and are still sort of wrapping their heads around task-based language teaching, what is the difference then between a task-supported syllabus and a fully task-based syllabus? Could you highlight 2 or 3 differences?
Okay. So coming back first of all to Mike Long, I mean, Mike was extremely influential in the field when he first began writing and right the way through his entire life. And as you've already said, he was very much a strong task-based advocate. That was where he was coming from. And I think his ideas were really radical at the time and stirred the community up at the time and got us thinking around a whole lot of stuff that we really needed to get our heads around to move practice on. Other scholars have been more moderated. So if you compare, for example, Rod Ellis to Mike Long, you see Rod Ellis tends to be more along the lines of, let's also consider some traditional practices. Let's also consider task-supported. I guess the main difference between the two models is that task-based, in its strongest sense, is focused purely on the task, which means that everything that teachers do in their classrooms is focused around tasks that students are involved with, whereas task-supported has that element of direct teaching and input that teachers provide either before a task is undertaken or after a task is undertaken. But you mentioned earlier my book, Foundational Principles, that I wrote a couple of years ago. One of my main drivers for writing that book was to try to go back to some of the bases of task-based language teaching and try to explore, well, what are the underpinning theoretical frameworks for task-based language teaching, and how does that work out in practice? But as you'll know in that book, what I did was basically come right back to the task itself and said, if we start with the task, we can get the task rate right, then we're on our way to developing a task-based approach. But there are different things that we can put around that, depending on, if you like, a continuum of practice of where teachers situate themselves. So at one end of a continuum of practice is a really strong task-based approach, which is all about the tasks. At another end of the continuum of practice is strong teacher-led input, either before or after the task, or both. And then teachers' practices tend to fluctuate along that continuum. And my own view is if they're on that continuum but are placing tasks in the center of at least what the students are doing when they're using language, we have got a form of task-based approach. So
Mm.
I think that's probably where I sit in this.
It's like it's basically having a foot in the door, right?
Yeah.
That's the way I see it. I mean, I look at our context. Like I'm the director of studies at a private language academy in Spain.
Yeah.
And next year we're looking to implement a task-supported syllabus for pretty much all of our teenage classes.
Yeah.
And this is only because my director and I, we've spent the last probably 2 or 3 years working together, looking at task-based language teaching, falling in love with it really, and realizing that okay, we also have a bit of freedom. We're a private language academy, so we've got freedom to implement that, and it's very much task supported. It's not going to be task based. I think for us there are a number of reasons. One, the teaching element. We have a lot of teachers that some are early career teachers, some are teachers with experience. But in terms of teaching tasks, we've provided some workshops, but it's not enough. And so there's that training element. There's also the learning element. Many of it, at least in my context, exam certifications are what learners are looking for. So there's also a business element there. And so these are some of the things why we've opted for a task supported syllabus in the next year. So I think like you said, that continuum, if tasks are in there, I think there's that's a good thing. I also hope that they, as a kind of a byproduct of having these in the syllabus, that teachers start to gain interest in task-based language teaching and explore further. That would be my hope. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would fully agree with you. It comes back to that principle of beginning where the teachers are at. And if we can get the task right and get teachers understanding what a task is and developing tasks and being able to use them and seeing success in their use of tasks, that's going to open them up more to experimenting further with tasks. And I think from time to time, it's good to challenge teachers in saying, okay, well, why don't you just try a lesson where you don't actually have any front-loaded teaching? You just try tasks out and see what happens, and give them those small opportunities to just try something, and then have an opportunity to debrief with them and say, well, how did that go? What did you learn? What did your students think about that? But yeah, those small nudging practice forward moments are, I think, important in all of this.
Yeah. So I think we both agree that task-based language teaching, or using tasks in whatever way that we're trying to do, is quite important for our sector, and for learners, wherever we are. Where do you see? I mean, task-based language teaching has evolved, as we've kind of mentioned already. But where do you see task-based language teaching in the next 10 years?
Okay, that's quite a challenging question. I mean, I think what we've seen over the last 40 years since task-based language was introduced has been the radical strong version that was introduced sort of around the 1980s, becoming moderated over time towards a task-supported approach. I wonder whether, as we head into the future, people will start experimenting again with stronger versions. That might be the way that it goes. These things do tend to go in those type of cycles. But I think also, as you said earlier, there's still quite a lot of confusion out there about exactly what task-based language teaching is and exactly what a task is. So I wonder whether we still need to have this fundamental teacher education that is saying, because look, let's start with a task. Let's get the task right. Let's understand what it is in theory. Let's understand what it is in practice. So I think we may see more experimentation as we go forward, leading us to perhaps slightly more strong versions as people try those out. But we're also going to need to see this continual embedding of foundational principles as we go through.
Right. I think perhaps one thing that works in the favor of TBLT, and you also talk about it about in your element about the New Zealand context, is that at least from government perspective, in government level, in educational reform, task-based language teaching has become more prevalent around the world, which is good. But obviously there are challenges with that, and like as you mentioned, working with teachers. But at least it's making ground in certain areas. So I'm quite optimistic over the next maybe 10 years is too short a time frame, but 20 years, 25 years, that it become more mainstream at least. I'd love to see it. And I mean, I'm not that much of a big fan of the 4-week pre-service courses, but if they're always going to stay here, but I would love to see more task-based language teaching on these courses. And because I know on MA courses, there's quite a large, if we're looking at methodology courses, there's a large component there. But it'd be great to have it on other pre-service courses as well. But speaking about teacher education related or around task-based language teaching, for those teacher educators that are looking to encourage task-based language teaching in their contexts, what would be the tips that you would give them, for whether it's raising awareness, whether it's running a workshop, whether it's telling teachers about tasks? What would be some tips that you give to teacher educators?
Right. I think I'd say, first of all, make sure that you yourself understand what a task is and understand something about the theory that informs task-based language teaching. So understand something around the whole input-output interaction theorizing that's gone on over the last 30, 40 years. So understand that theoretical basis, understand what a task is, and then begin to introduce those ideas to the particular teachers that you might be working with. And getting them to think about, well, what do you think about this? How does this fit in with how you've learned a language up to now, or how you've taught a language up to now? How does this fit in with what you believe about effective teaching? And then getting teachers perhaps collaboratively to be designing some tasks that they could try out in their own contexts. And then let them go and try it out and see what happens.
Yeah. Brilliant. There was a part in your element where you spoke about I think it was the first course that you ran, and teachers went away and they tried tasks, and then you got some feedback from them after some time, and they came up against perhaps opinions already established by other teachers that were there that made them not want to continue with using tasks. And then you, in your, I think it was in maybe your second or your third, after you implemented a part of the program that looked at dealing with the realities to try and prepare them for this. Is that something that we need to consider as well?
Yeah, I think it's important, because if we ignore the realities of the real classroom context and pretend that it isn't there, then I think that the teachers are going to become more wary about trying these ideas out, because we're denying a reality that they're actually going to confront in their real lives. So I found, as I was going through the experiences I was working with teachers, it would have been dishonest of me to pretend that those problems didn't exist. It was much better for me to say, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I hear these particular challenges you're coming up with. Let's have a look at those and let's see what we could do to overcome those in the context you're working in. So yeah, I think we do need to do that. We've got to be honest around the reality of what it is day-to-day teaching.
Yeah. Just something that's come to my mind now. This idea about the creation of tasks, which is I think that's one thing that works against task-based language teaching is the resources that are available for teachers. There's a brilliant book written by Anderson and McCutcheon that was in 2019, Activities for Task-Based Language Teaching by Delta. And that's probably the first of its kind that I've seen. And I know that there's a you have to forgive me, I've forgotten the name, but there's a website that's a task base online, which I've accessed a few times.
Yeah, the Language Learning Task Bank.
Yes.
Is that the one you're thinking of? Yeah.
Yeah. Creating tasks. Obviously, we need to understand what a task is.
Yeah.
Do you agree with the opinion that the tasks need to be based on their real world needs, in a sense. So there's this idea that a task needs to have a real world function. And my problem as a task-based language teacher practitioner, and also as a director of studies working with, for example, children and teenagers, is often they don't have a real world need right now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that perspective?
Okay. If you look at it from Mike Long's perspective, Mike was very much into the whole needs analysis business. So if he were wanting to plan a task-based course, he would begin by trying to find out what the needs of his particular students were, and to identify from those needs the tasks that they might need to perform in their everyday lives, and then move those into pedagogic tasks. However, the reality often can be that students don't have particular needs in terms of tasks. They need to develop their language skills. So I think in those cases, tasks can be more generic things that we get students to do. And we also need to understand a bit about authenticity here. When we talk about tasks being real life, sometimes we think of that in terms of having to replicate a real life scenario. Like, so for example, the traditional role play of ordering food and drink in a cafe that can be developed into a task. We think of that as being authentic. But authenticity is also around the ways in which students use language when they're talking to each other. So when students interact, they might interact about absolutely anything, but there are particular skills that they bring to interaction that enables communication to continue. That's a dimension of authenticity. So a real world task can be something that simply enables the type of interaction that students might have with each other in other contexts outside of the classroom. So we can, we need to broaden out our understanding of authenticity from the situational to the interactional, I think.
That's a really interesting point. I don't think I've ever thought about in that sense the idea of this authenticity in terms of the interaction element. That's quite interesting. I need to explore that, I think. On this idea of working with perhaps young learners and teenagers, there was a brilliant study by Shintani. Obviously, you're very familiar with it, and Shintani wrote a book about working or using tasks with young learners, and there's quite a lot of research around that. But it's still something that as a task-based language teaching advocate myself, that's the biggest kickback I get from teachers, is that it doesn't work with young learners, and it doesn't work with teenagers in large classes. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think, as you've mentioned, Shintani's study demonstrated that task-based language teaching, compared to a more traditional present practice production model, can be effective for young learners. That was what her whole study was about, basically. Yet there can be challenges in classrooms with young learners, particularly if you've got a large group of people. But those challenges exist no matter what pedagogical approach you're having. Students can be off task for different reasons. They can be unmotivated for different reasons. And I think this is where perhaps more of a task-supported approach rather than a task-based approach can be helpful, because you can then intersperse the tasks with more directed and more controlled aspects of practice that might help to focus students or bring their attention back when they're wandering and stuff like that. So I don't think we should dismiss task-based language teaching as not being relevant to young learners or adolescents in large classes, but we need to see how we put the whole teacher management around that to make it effective.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Really, really important. In fact, I actually ran teachers through a workshop, and I ran a session at a conference recently, actually, on using tasks with young learners, and there are small things that we can take into consideration, like looking at the importance of L1 or modeling, and seeing that if we're taking a task supported syllabus, it's actually quite doable in many circumstances. But again, it's looking at the context, realizing, okay, I need these resources to do this. Which may be quite difficult for some teachers, but hopefully times will change. But thinking about teachers getting into task-based language teaching, one of the first places is generally books. It's not usually management pushing down this or things like that.
Yeah.
What book recommendations would you have for teachers starting with or getting interested in task-based language teaching?
Okay. Well, I think you're aware that I recently published in language teaching an essential bookshelf piece, which gave me an opportunity to identify 12 pieces of writing that people might want to begin with if they wanted to start exploring task-based language teaching. That was a brilliant opportunity there for me to have an opportunity to take a step back and to think about what would I recommend. And so when I wrote that piece, I was thinking about the work that I have introduced to my own students and the types of things that I know explore some of the fundamental issues around task-based language teaching. So that particular article, Martini's Essential Bookshelf for Task-Based Language Teaching, is available for free download, which is great. So it's available for anybody to have a look at some of the works that I'd recommend.
Yeah, I think I've got this one here.
Okay, I see your screen sharing that. Yeah, it's I really enjoyed writing that article because it gave me the opportunity to step back and actually think about how did I begin my own journey into task-based language teaching? What influenced me? What are some of the key things? So, I mean, that's a good place to start in actually getting a good handle on task-based language teaching. One of the elements that was published just before mine, as you know, was Daniel Jackson's book on task-based language teaching. That's also useful to have a look at because, as with my own element, it's relatively short. So it does enable quite an easy read. And what I liked about Jackson's book was that he goes very much into the task construct at the beginning of that and unpacks it with examples of how it might work. So he'll put a particular example of a task out there and then he'll explain, this is how this might work in practice. So I particularly liked what he had to say. And I would also recommend my own book, Foundational Principles, and not only because, as I said, I wrote it deliberately to go back to some of the foundational principles of task-based language teaching, but also, as you said, it's open access, so available for free download, and that therefore removes a number of barriers that teachers often have in being able to access resources.
I also think that your book is written in a way that's quite accessible to teachers. So, for example, I have both these lovely books here, by Ellis and Ito and by Long.
And by Long, yeah.
But in terms of being accessible in terms of their writing style, for many teachers, perhaps they're not. I love them. They're great reads and they full of amazing amounts of information. But I don't think they're accessible for all teachers in terms of the way they're written or the way they look at research, for example.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with you there. I mean, these are fantastic colleagues and they do fantastic work, and I really respect those particular volumes. But that was, again, another motivator for me writing the Foundational Principles book, was that I could see that these were not necessarily fully accessible to teachers, which was really my target audience. And so I wanted to write something that was more readable and more user-friendly, really.
Yeah. So speaking about your work, what's next for you? Is there any more research into task-based language teaching that you can let us in on, or is there something in the pipeline?
I'm starting to think more about the in-service space. I recently took part in a very small scale in-service professional development opportunity for teachers of Asian languages. And teaching Asian languages through a task-based approach presents its own problems because of the complexity of Asian languages, because quite often teachers of Asian languages come themselves from a Confucian heritage culture where they're used to very much teacher-led stuff. So this was a very small-scale professional development opportunity for teachers of Asian languages. And I'm now working through the data that I collected from that, and I'm hoping in the next year or so that will get published. And that will raise some issues around in-service and how we support in-service teachers with moving forward with task-based stuff.
That's really interesting. Looking at the differences then at the language that's being taught and perhaps the teachers that are generally teaching that. I wouldn't have thought about there'd be those challenges, but obviously you're saying that there are. Looking at in-service particularly, then I'm actually I'm completing my master's at the moment, and it's in trainer development, and I'm preparing a course. It's obviously a fake course, but it's a course for an in-service course for task-based language teaching. It's a two-week course. I'd be interested to hear your opinion on a 2-week course. What elements of for in-service teachers this is, with some experience. What elements would you expect to see in that course?
I'd expect to see right at the start an exploration of where the teachers are currently at. So this goes back to what I said earlier in this conversation. Start with the teachers, find out where they're currently at, what they currently do, what they currently believe, and use that as a basis to start exploring some of the ideas that they bring out from that. From that, quite quickly move into introducing them to the task construct. So it doesn't have to be at that particular point around all the theory that underpins it, but at least look at, this is a task, this is how we differentiate a task from an activity, and getting them thinking clearly around that. And then once people are clear on, this is what I believe, this is an introduction to what a task is within task-based, then it's an opportunity to get students to actually creating tasks for themselves and trying them out and seeing where they might go. So that's certainly what I would begin with if I've only got 2 weeks with a group of teachers.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Again, 2 weeks, not a long time.
No.
Before we head off, I just wanted to touch on one other thing that I found really, really interesting from your element. And it was this idea of S-step methodology.
Okay.
Something that I read about in Bakuzin's element, but I misunderstood it. I thought it was just self-study. But after reading your element, I went away and I read it's Piercy and Sharkey's article on S-step, and it's quite a detailed methodology to looking at your own practices.
Yes, it is.
Would you be able to give me just a quick 2-minute intro as to one, what it is, and how valuable you think it was to your practice?
Okay. S-step is really an extension of reflective practice. And I personally believe, and I make this very clear in the element, if you are a teacher educator, and especially if you're a teacher educator encouraging teachers to reflect on their own practices, then we cannot escape the obligation to reflect on what we do as teacher educators. So that's the beginnings of self-study. Self-study is really that opportunity to take a step back from our own practices, to look at what we do and to consider what we're doing in the light of the work that we're doing with the teachers that we're working with. Now, S-step as a methodology contains quite a number of elements that might involve, for example, autoethnography. So a teacher going back and keeping a diary of their own personal reflections of what they're doing in the background, or presenting accounts of what they are experiencing and what they think about that. What I did in my element was to take the data that I'd collected externally to me and to use that as a stepping stone into S-step. But S-step is actually quite a sophisticated methodology that draws on different strands to really get us to critique and think about our own practice, why we do the things we do, and thinking about what does that mean? Should we continue with that? Should we change that, etc.
It's after as you mentioned, you're quite positive about it in your element, and after reading the article, being someone who encourages teachers to engage in reflective practice, obviously we try to model that as well. And I think this is a brilliant example of teacher educators modeling reflective practice, but at perhaps the next level. And I kept thinking, this is something that I need to do. I think at the moment I have a lot on my plate, but certainly in the future, it's definitely something I'd like to explore. But I had never heard of it before I read the elements.
Right.
So I'm not sure if it's within the world of academia. Perhaps it's quite popular. I'm not sure, or common. But at least for me, I'd never heard of it.
Right. Interestingly, it isn't really that mainstream. As I explained in the element, it's been around for quite a number of years. And there are a dedicated circle of academics who work particularly in STEP, including some here in New Zealand who I know very, very well. But despite that, it hasn't really infiltrated, particularly in language teaching and learning, as a mainstream methodology. And I think that's a shame. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to write that element, was to actually give an example of how this might work. But as I also said in the element, in a sense, that was an innovation in itself, trying out this methodology, because it isn't mainstream at the moment, really.
Yeah. Well, Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you this morning. Really, really insightful. And of course, this is only a 45-minute chat on your perspective. And there's so much more that we could go into theatre too, but we don't have all the time in the world. I want to say thank you for sitting down with me and sharing your thoughts.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate the invitation and this opportunity to talk to you. It's been a really enjoyable 45 minutes. Thank you.
No, well, hopefully we'll see each other at a conference one day in the future, and I look forward to, I look forward to reading more of your stuff. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Take
Thanks.
care. Bye, Martin.
See you.